Ambassador Talon Dreyer was standing near the observation window of the Galactic Forum station called the Concorde when the first transmission arrived, and it changed everything he thought he knew about the universe. The message came in broken and full of static, a voice screaming through layers of interference, and the only words he could make out were Eden, and they are killing everyone, before the signal collapsed into silence. He stood frozen for a long moment, his coffee cup still halfway to his lips, and then he set it down with a trembling hand and walked to the communications console as fast as his legs could carry him. Colony Eden 7 was a world of green fields and blue rivers, a place where families had gone to build something new, far from the crowded cities of Earth. And it was home to 1,200,000 human beings who had done nothing wrong except exist in a corner of space that the Velkari Dominion considered too close to their border. Dreyer tried to open a channel to Eden 7, but there was nothing, not even the hum of a carrier signal, just dead air where a living world had been broadcasting only hours before. He contacted Earth next, and the response came within minutes, which told him that they already knew, that the military channels had been burning with emergency traffic long before his diplomatic station had picked up anything at all. Ambassador, the voice on the other end said, and it belonged to a woman he recognized as Commander Hale from the UEC Defense Bureau. Eden 7 has been hit, and we need you to stay exactly where you are and wait for further instructions. Hit by what? He asked, though he already felt the answer crawling up his spine like something cold and alive. The Velkari, she said. 200 warships, no warning, no declaration, they just came out of FTL and started burning everything. In the hours that followed, the information came in pieces, each one worse than the last, like a puzzle that revealed a nightmare the more you put it together. The Velkari war fleet had arrived in Eden 7 orbit at dawn local time, when the children were getting ready for school, and the farmers were walking out to check their crops, and the defense satellites were running on their usual low alert cycle, because nobody had expected war. The satellites were destroyed in the first 90 seconds, swatted out of the sky like insects, and then the bombardment began. They did not target military installations, because there were almost none on Eden 7, and they did not target infrastructure in any strategic way, because this was not a military operation in any sense that humans understood. This was a culling. The Velkari landed ground forces after the initial bombardment. Thousands of armored soldiers who moved through the burning towns with scanners and containment fields, and they sorted the survivors into groups, the way a farmer might sort grain from chaff. The old and the sick were killed immediately, their bodies left where they fell, and the rest were herded into open fields, where they were catalogued by species and age, and then executed in rows with plasma dischargers that left nothing but ash and silence. Children were not separated from their parents, not out of mercy, but out of efficiency, because it was easier to kill them together than to waste time pulling them apart. The black box recordings from Eden 7's emergency archive were recovered 3 days later by a UEC stealth ship that slipped into the system after the Velkari fleet had gone, and when the footage was reviewed at Earth Command, several officers had to leave the room, and one woman who had served 30 years in the military sat down on the floor and wept. The recordings showed a school teacher named Mara Okafor gathering 42 children into the basement of her school and singing to them to keep them calm, while the ceiling shook and dust rained down on their heads, and the last thing the camera captured before the building was leveled was her voice telling them that everything was going to be all right. It was not all right. Of the 1,197,422 people who had lived on Eden 7, fewer than 3,000 survived, and most of them had done so only by hiding in caves or drainage tunnels, or beneath the bodies of the dead. When the Galactic Forum held an emergency session to address the attack, Dreyer sat in his chair and watched the representatives of a dozen elder species offer their carefully worded statements of concern. The Rathani delegate expressed deep regret at the loss of life, and suggested that humanity might wish to reconsider the placement of its frontier colonies. The Torvan delegate reminded the assembly that the Velkari Dominion had well-established territorial boundaries. Younger species were expected to respect those boundaries. The Chelith delegate said nothing at all, which was its own kind of statement. Not a single species condemned the attack. Not a single species called it what it was, a massacre, a slaughter, a crime so enormous that it should have shaken the foundations of their precious forum. The Velkari representative, a tall creature with 4 arms and eyes like polished black stones, sat calmly in its seat and watched the proceedings with what Dreyer could only describe as boredom, as though the extermination of over 1 million people was simply a matter of administrative record-keeping. When it was the Velkari delegate's turn to speak, it stood and said in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever that the Dominion conducted a standard territorial correction in accordance with established Dominion law, and that the human settlement in the designated zone had been assessed and removed as per standard. Standard culling protocol. Dreyer felt something break inside him when he heard those words. Not his heart, because that had already been shattered by the footage from Eden 7. But something deeper. Something that had always believed that if the wider galaxy saw what had happened, they would care, they would act, they would stand beside humanity and say that this was wrong. That something died in the forum chamber, and what replaced it was cold and hard and patient. After the session ended, Dreyer walked to his office alone and sat in the dark for 20 minutes before he opened a secure channel to Earth, to the office of the Secretary General herself, and he spoke 7 words that would set the galaxy on a path it could never turn back from. Eden has fallen, he said. They killed everyone, awaiting instructions. He closed the channel and sat back in his chair and looked out the window at the stars, all those billions of lights, scattered across the black, and he wondered how many of them shone down on species that had been culled and forgotten, erased from existence, while the galaxy watched and did nothing. Back on Earth, the message arrived in the middle of the night, and it woke Secretary General Anara Osei from a sleep she had not been able to find for 3 days. She read the 7 words on her screen and closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, there was something in them that her closest advisors would later describe as terrifying, not because she looked angry, but because she looked certain. She picked up her secure phone and made one call. "Wake everyone up," she said, "all of them, every council member, every admiral, every chief of staff, and tell them to be in the war room in 1 hour." She paused for a moment, and then added 5 words that would echo through history. Project Aegis is now active, somewhere in the cold dark between the stars, in shipyards hidden inside hollowed asteroids that no galactic survey had ever found. Lights began to turn on for the first time in decades, and machines that had been sleeping since before most of the galaxy knew humanity existed began to hum and warm and wake. The galaxy had made its choice when it chose silence. Now, humanity would make its own. 3 weeks after the massacre of Colony Eden 7, the galaxy noticed something strange about humanity, and that something was silence. Every human diplomatic channel went dark on the same day at the same hour, as though someone had flipped a single switch and shut off an entire civilization's voice all at once. Trade convoys that had been carrying goods between human worlds and alien markets changed course without explanation, turning back toward Earth-controlled space like fish swimming upstream before a flood. Human embassies on 14 different alien stations recalled their staff, packed their belongings, and left behind empty offices with locked doors and wiped computer systems. The shipping lanes that humanity had used for decades were suddenly empty, and the cargo haulers and passenger liners and scientific vessels that had been a constant presence in the galactic network simply vanished, as though they had never existed. Station. The human delegation's offices went dark, and Ambassador Dreyer was seen boarding a transport back to Earth without a word to anyone, not even the Rithani counselor Yeleth, who had been one of the few aliens to show him genuine kindness after the attack. The galaxy talked about the silence the way people talk about a strange noise in the night, with nervous laughter and theories that grew less confident the longer it lasted. The Torvand said that humanity was collapsing, that the loss of Eden 7 had broken their will, and they were retreating inward to lick their wounds and eventually die, as so many young species had before them. The Cheleths said nothing, as was their way, but their intelligence operatives quietly increased surveillance on every human system they could still observe. The Velkari Dominion, under the command of High Dominarch Sekvaros, did not even bother to discuss it, because in the Dominarch's estimate, humanity was already finished, a species of barely 600 combat-capable ships that had just learned the hard lesson that the galaxy taught all weak civilizations sooner or later. Sekvaros was already planning his next move, a push deeper into the territory humanity had claimed, because why stop at one colony when the prey was clearly unable to fight back? But on Earth, behind the silence, behind the dark embassies and empty shipping lanes, something was happening that the galaxy could not see and would not have believed if it could. In Geneva, in a bunker buried 300 meters beneath the old city, Secretary General Inara Osei stood at the head of a long table, surrounded by the most powerful people in human civilization. There were admirals and generals and intelligence directors and scientists. And there were also people whose names did not appear on any official record, people who had spent their entire careers working on things that the rest of humanity did not know existed. The room was quiet, and on the wall behind Osei was a single image, a photograph taken from orbit of Eden 7 after the attack, showing a world of black scars and gray ash where green fields had been only weeks before. "You have all seen the footage," Osei said, and her voice was steady in a way that made several people in the room uncomfortable, because steadiness in the face of something like Eden 7 was not a sign of calm, but of something far more dangerous. "You know what they did, and you know what the galaxy said when we asked for help." She paused and looked around the table. "They said nothing, and nothing is exactly what we owe them in return." Admiral Konrad Vasek, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from stone by someone who did not believe in smiling, stood and activated a holographic display that filled the center of the room with light. "Project Aegis," he said, and the words landed in the silence like a hammer on an anvil. Anvil. For 80 years since the very first decade of humanity's expansion into the stars, a small group of planners and engineers and military theorists had been working on something that officially did not exist. They had looked at the galaxy and seen what it truly was, not a community of enlightened species working together for the common good, but a wilderness where the strong devoured the weak, and the rules only applied to those without the power to break them. And so they had built, quietly and patiently, in places no one would ever think to look. Inside hollowed-out asteroids and dead systems that appeared on no star charts, entire shipyards had been constructed, crewed by people who had signed away their names and their lives in service of a secret they could never share. The ships they built were not like the vessels the galaxy knew humanity possessed, the modest frigates and patrol cruisers that other species scanned and catalogued. Dismissed. These were warships designed by a species that had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing its own kind. And they carried weapons that the Galactic Forum had banned centuries ago, not because those weapons did not work, but because they worked too well. Humanity had never signed those treaties, because humanity had never been invited to, because humanity had been considered too young and too weak to matter. The irony was sharp enough to cut. The holographic display showed the numbers, and even some of the people in the room who had known about Aegis in the abstract felt their breath catch when they saw the scale of what had been hidden. Over 8,000 warships, organized into 12 shadow fleets, each one capable of operating independently for months without resupply. Kinetic accelerator platforms that could crack a planetary defense shield with a single shot. Self-replicating drone swarms that could overwhelm any point defense system ever designed. Gravity pulse warheads that collapse structures from the inside, turning space stations and orbital fortresses into twisted metal in seconds. And perhaps most terrifying of all, a new FTL drive system that did not use the standard galactic space lanes, but instead created temporary corridors through dimensions that other species had declared too dangerous to explore, allowing human ships to appear anywhere in the galaxy without warning. "We have been preparing for this for 80 years, Vasek said, and I will not pretend that we did not hope this day would never come. But it has come, and we are ready." The debate that followed was fierce and real, because despite what the galaxy might later believe, humanity did not rush toward violence with eagerness. The doves in the room argued for one more attempt at diplomacy, for taking the evidence to the forum and demanding real action, for building a coalition of sympathetic species. But the hawks asked a simple question that the doves could not answer. Who in the galaxy had shown even the smallest willingness to stand beside humanity when it mattered? The forum had offered words when what was needed was justice. The elder species had shrugged at the death of over 1 million people and suggested that humanity should have known better. And the Valkyrie had called it standard protocol, as though the extermination of children was just another line item in a bureaucratic ledger. "If we go back to the forum and beg," Vasek said, and his voice was like ice, "we confirm exactly what they already believe about us, that we are weak, that we are prey, and that we can be culled whenever it is convenient. And the next time it will not be 1 colony, it will be 10, or 100, or Earth itself." He looked at Osei. "We do not need allies who only respect us when we are useful. We need the galaxy to understand that touching humanity has a cost so high that no rational civilization would ever consider paying it." Osei listened to every voice in the room, and then she stood and made the decision that would reshape the galaxy forever. "Activate all 12 shadow fleets," she said, "and prepare Ambassador Dreyer for his return to the forum, because before we move a single ship, the galaxy is going to hear exactly what is coming and why." 6,000 light-years away, High Dominarch Sekvaros sat on his throne and reviewed reports from his intelligence network that told him humanity had perhaps 2 months before total economic collapse, and he smiled with all 3 rows of his teeth and began drafting orders for the next wave of expansion into human space. He did not know about the asteroids, or the ships, or the weapons, or the fury that was building behind humanity's silence. He would learn soon enough. And on the forum station, alone in her quarters, Counselor Yilith of the Rithani pulled up ancient records from the deepest archives her species maintained. Records that stretched back 1 million years and covered 10,000 civilizations. She was looking for a pattern, a precedent, any species that had gone this quiet after suffering this kind of loss. She found several. Some of them had collapsed inward and died, just as the Torvan predicted. But others, and these were the entries that made her blood run cold, had gone quiet because they were building something. And when they finally broke their silence, the galaxy had never been the same again. She closed the archive and sat in the dark for a long time, and for the first time in her very long life, Counselor Yelith was afraid. 4 weeks after the fall of Colony Eden 7, Ambassador Talon Dreyer walked back into the Great Hall of the Galactic Forum, and the moment he appeared in the doorway, Every conversation in the chamber stopped. He looked different from the man who had left, thinner in the face, harder in the eyes, and dressed entirely in black, from his collar to his boots. This was not a color that human diplomats typically wore to the forum, but every species in the room instinctively understood it as a signal of something heavy and final. He did not greet anyone as he walked to the human delegation's platform, did not acknowledge the stares or the whispers, or the way several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The hall of the forum was designed to hold representatives from over 300 species, a vast circular chamber with tiered seating that rose in rings around a central stage. And today it was nearly full, because word had spread that the humans were coming back, and everyone wanted to see what a broken species looked like when it came to beg. The Velkari representative, a tall figure named Dominion Voice Karesh, sat in the Velkari section with his forearms folded across his chest, and his black eyes fixed on Dryer with what could only be described as amusement. The Rathani delegation sat near the top of the chamber, and among them, Counselor Ileth watched Dryer, with a feeling in her chest that was not amusement at all, but something much closer to dread. Dryer reached his platform and stood behind the podium, and said nothing for a full 30 seconds, letting the silence build until it became uncomfortable, until the delegates who had come to watch began to shift and look at each other, and wonder if perhaps the human had lost his ability to speak. Then he raised his hand, and the chamber's massive display screens came to life. "Before I deliver my government statement," he said, and his voice was calm, clear, and completely without warmth, "you will watch this." The footage that played was unedited, pulled directly from the emergency black box archives of Colony Eden 7, and it showed everything. It showed the sky turning red as the Velkari fleet opened fire on a world that had no weapons capable of firing back. It showed buildings collapsing, and fields burning, and people running through streets filled with smoke and ash, carrying children in their arms, and screaming for help that would never come. It showed the Velkari ground forces moving through the ruins with their scanners and their containment fields, sorting living human beings into lines the way machines sort objects on a conveyor belt. It showed a man on his knees, pleading for the life of his daughter, while a Velkari soldier raised a plasma discharger to his head. It showed the school teacher Mara Okafor, singing to 42 children in a basement, her voice shaking, but never stopping, right up until the moment the building above them was hit, and the recording ended in a burst of static. The footage ran for 12 minutes, and when it was done, the chamber was silent in a way that was different from the silence before, heavier and sick with something that even the most detached alien species could not entirely ignore. Several delegates had left the chamber during the playback, unable or unwilling to watch, and those who remained wore expressions that ranged from shock to guilt to carefully maintained blankness. The Velkari representative had not moved, had not looked away, had not shown a single flicker of response, and that absence of reaction was perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. Dryer let the silence hang for another 10 seconds before he spoke again. 1,197,422, he said. "That is the number of human beings who were alive on Eden 7 before your standard. The culling protocol was carried out, and that is the number you will remember, because we will make certain of it." He reached into his coat and pulled out a single sheet of paper, actual paper, which was an unusual thing to see in a chamber that ran on holographic displays and quantum data streams, and the deliberate simplicity of it made the moment feel ancient and heavy and real. "I will now read the official declaration of the United Earth Confederacy," he said, addressed to the Velkari Dominion and to every nation represented in this chamber. He began to read, and his voice did not shake. "To the Velkari Dominion, and to all nations of the galactic community who bore witness and chose silence. On the 14th of March, 2347, 1,197,422 human beings, men, women, and children, were slaughtered on Colony Eden 7 in an act of unprovoked extermination. The Galactic Forum offered words. Did not shield our children. Words did not stop the killing fields. Words are no longer sufficient. He paused, and the silence in the hall was so complete that every delegate could hear the breath of the species sitting next to them. Effective immediately, the United Earth Confederacy recognizes no state of peace with the Valkyrie Dominion. We do not seek negotiation. We do not seek mediation. We do not seek terms. We seek only this. For every one of our dead, we will take 1,000 of yours. A ripple went through the chamber, a collective intake of breath from 300 species at once. Not soldiers, Dreyer continued, and his voice had dropped to something quiet and final. Not worlds, souls, until the debt is paid or your civilization ceases to exist, whichever comes first. This is not a war. Wars end. This is a reckoning. You taught us what the galaxy is. Rewards. PP. We learned. The paper in his hand was steady, and when he finished reading, he folded it once and placed it on the podium and looked up at the chamber with eyes that held nothing in them that any species could mistake for bluff. The eruption was immediate. Half the chamber burst into shouting, delegates rising from their seats and pointing and demanding to know if this was serious, if humanity had lost its mind, if this was some kind of desperate performance designed to save face before the inevitable collapse. The Torvan ambassador called it the death rattle of a species too foolish to accept its place in the natural order. The Chelith delegate activated its translation matrix for the first time anyone could remember, and said one word that translated roughly as unwise. And Dominion voice Karesh, the Valkyrie representative, stood from his seat and let out a sound that his species used to express contempt and amusement at the same time, a clicking of his mandibles that echoed through the chamber. This is the desperate bark of a dying species, he said, and his translated voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who had never once in his life been afraid. The Dominion acknowledges this tantrum and looks forward to conducting the next territorial correction at its earliest convenience. Several alien delegates actually laughed. But not all of them. The Rathani delegation did not laugh, and the Jorvan observers did not laugh, and a handful of smaller species who had survived their own encounters with larger predators did not laugh, because they recognized something in Dreyer's voice that the others had missed. Not desperation, not madness, but the terrible calm of someone who has already accepted what comes next. After the session ended, Counselor Yeleth found Dreyer in the corridor outside the chamber, walking alone toward the docking bay where his transport waited. "Ambassador," she said, and he stopped and turned to look at her with those hard, quiet eyes. "Counselor, I must ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Ask, does your species truly mean what was said in that chamber? Because the numbers you described, 1,000 for every one, that is not justice, that is extermination, that is the end of the Valkyrie as a people, and I need to know if the United Earth Confederacy understands what it has promised." Dreyer looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was not angry or threatening or theatrical. It was simply factual, like someone stating the temperature of a room. "Counselor Yeleth, in our entire history as a species, stretching back 10,000 years to when we were still killing each other with sharpened metal on a single small world, we have never once made a threat we did not fulfill." He paused. "Your archives go back 1,000,000 years, and you have studied us since we first appeared on the galactic stage. So I would encourage you to check our record and see if you can find a single exception." He turned and walked away, and Yeleth stood in the corridor and watched him go. and she felt something she had not felt in 300 years of life. Genuine, bone-deep fear. Not of what humanity might do if pushed to the edge, but of what the galaxy had done by pushing them there. Within 1 hour, the declaration was broadcast on every known communication frequency in the galaxy, transmitted in 400 languages, and repeated on a loop that would not stop. Within 2 hours, the Valkyrie Dominion issued a formal response calling the declaration amusing and announcing accelerated military operations in the border region. Within 3 hours, 17 minor species quietly began evacuating their citizens from any system within 50 light-years of human space. And within 4 hours, Counselor Ileth had pulled the Rythani historical records on humanity and read them cover to cover for the second time in a week. And when she was done, she contacted the Rythani Homeworld Council and told them something she had never told them before. Prepare contingency measures, she said. Not because the humans are going to lose, but because I believe they are going to win, and what comes after that is going to change everything. On Earth, in the bunker beneath Geneva, Secretary General Oze watched the broadcast of Dreyer's declaration and the chaos that followed, and she nodded once. They are laughing, Admiral Vasek said from beside her. Good, she said. Let them laugh. It will make the silence that follows so much louder. Across human space, in the hidden shipyards and secret staging areas, and the cold dark places between the stars, 8,000 warships completed their final system checks and powered up their engines and waited for the order that everyone knew was coming. The galaxy had heard the words. Now it would learn what happened when humanity meant them. High Dominarch Sekvaros had positioned his finest war fleet along the border of human space. 3,000 warships arranged in a perfect formation, designed to crush any desperate attack the humans might attempt. And he waited with the patience of a predator who already knows how the hunt ends. He waited for 5 weeks. The humans never came. Instead, on a quiet morning in the Dominion's deep interior, a supply station called Vereth 9 that served as the primary food distribution hub for 11 colony worlds simply ceased to exist. There was no warning, no approaching fleet on long-range sensors, no subspace distortion from standard FTL travel. One moment the station was there, and the next moment there was a flash of light and a field of debris where 60,000 tons of processed nutrients and the 200 Valkyrie crew members who maintained them had been. 4 hours later, on the opposite side of Dominion space, an energy relay network that powered the industrial forges of 3 major shipyard systems went dark. Every node destroyed simultaneously by weapons that left behind a radiation signature that Valkyrie scientists had never seen before. 6 hours after that, the primary FTL communication array that connected the Dominion's military command to its outer territories was hit, and suddenly Sekvaros could not talk to a third of his empire. By the end of the first day, 17 critical infrastructure targets across the Dominion had been destroyed, and not a single human ship had been detected before or after any of the attacks. The Valkyrie warfleet at the border had not moved, because there was nothing to move toward. The attacks were happening hundreds of light years behind them, deep inside territory that should have been impossible to reach without passing through the Dominion's layered sensor networks and defense stations. But the humans were not using the space lanes that the galaxy had mapped and monitored for centuries. They were coming through somewhere else, appearing out of nowhere like ghosts walking through walls, and by the time anyone detected their presence, they were already gone, and something vital was burning. Sekvaros recalled half his border fleet to hunt for the attackers, but it was like trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. The human strike groups were small, fast, and ruthlessly efficient, hitting a target and vanishing back into whatever impossible dimension they traveled through before Dominion ships could respond. And while the Dominion military chased shadows, the real hammer fell. Admiral Conrad Vasek brought the 1st through 4th Shadow Fleets out of hiding in a single coordinated emergence that lit up Dominion sensors across an entire sector. And for the first time, the Velkari saw what humanity had been building in the dark for 80 years. The reports that reached Sekvaros made him read them twice. They could not be correct. His intelligence had told him that humanity possessed approximately 600 combat-capable vessels. The sensor readings showed over 3,000 ships in 4 fleet groups, and those were only the ones that had chosen to be visible. The ships themselves were wrong in every way that the Dominion's military analysts understood the word, because they did not match any known human design profile, and they carried weapons signatures that the galaxy had not seen in active service for over 1,000 years. Weapons that the Galactic Forum had banned specifically because they were too destructive to be used by civilized species. The first major engagement happened at a place the humans would later call the Battle of the Veil, named for the nebula that hung like a curtain near Velkar Prime's outer defense perimeter. The Dominion's first Grand Armada, 1,400 warships under the command of Fleet Commander Torek, moved to intercept Vasek's fleet with the confidence of a force that outnumbered its enemy and had never lost a major engagement in 2 centuries. The battle lasted 6 hours. Vasek's fleet used weapons that the Dominion had no defense against, kinetic accelerators that fired projectiles at a fraction of light speed, and punched through shields that were designed to stop energy weapons, not physical impacts, moving faster than anything the Dominion had ever encountered. Self-replicating drone swarms poured out of human carriers by the millions, tiny machines that attached themselves to Dominion hulls and dismantled them from the outside, while the crews inside scrambled to understand what was happening. Gravity pulse warheads detonated in the spaces between Dominion ships and created localized distortions that crushed vessels inward like hands squeezing empty cans. When it was over, the first Grand Armada had lost 1,400 ships. 90p. The gap was not the kind of difference that could be explained by luck or tactics. It was generational. The difference between a species that had spent its history in relative safety and a species that had spent 10,000 years in an unbroken chain of wars against the most dangerous enemy it had ever known, which was itself. News of the Veil spread across the galaxy faster than any official communication could travel, carried by traders and spies and panicked refugees who had witnessed the battle from the edges of the system. On the Forum station, delegates gathered in clusters and spoke in hushed voices about what they had heard. And for the first time since the massacre of Eden 7, no one was laughing at humanity. The Torvan, who had called the declaration a death rattle, quietly reassigned their border fleets. The Kelith, who had said unwise, began constructing additional defense platforms around their home system. And dozens of smaller species that had never paid much attention to the young civilization from Earth suddenly began sending private diplomatic messages to the UEC, offering trade agreements, military access, and friendship. The same friendship they had been too busy to offer when Eden 7 was burning. Counselor Yelith watched all of this from recorders and felt no satisfaction, only the grim confirmation of what she had feared. Inside the Dominion, the situation was deteriorating faster than Sekvaros could control. The infrastructure attacks had not stopped. They had accelerated. And without food distribution hubs and energy networks, the Dominion's colony worlds were beginning to starve and freeze. Military shipyards that should have been producing replacement vessels were dark, their power sources destroyed, and the raw materials that should have been flowing through supply chains were sitting in depots that no longer had the communication links to coordinate deliveries. Dominion was a vast machine, and the humans had not tried to destroy the machine. They had simply removed the parts that made it work, with the surgical precision of someone who understood exactly how complex systems failed. Sekvaros gathered his remaining military commanders and demanded solutions, But the solutions required time and resources that the Dominion no longer had, because every day brought new attacks and new losses, and the slow, grinding realization that this war was not going the way anyone had expected. And then the humans did something that broke the Dominion's spirit more effectively than any weapon could. They broadcast a counter on every communication frequency that the Dominion still controlled. On every screen and every display and every data terminal across Valkyrie space, a number appeared. It read, "Debt owed, 1,197,422,000. Below it, a second number, "Debt paid, 7,234,891. And below that, remaining, 1,190,109. The numbers updated in real time, ticking upward with every Valkyrie life lost, every ship destroyed, every station that went silent. And it was visible to every citizen of the Dominion at every hour of every day, a constant reminder that the humans were keeping count, and that the count was very, very far from finished. The effect on Dominion morale was devastating. Soldiers who had fought with confidence their entire lives began to hesitate, because the enemy they faced was not just powerful, it was relentless and methodical, and it had made a promise that it clearly intended to keep. And the mathematics of that promise meant the extinction of everything they knew. Civilian populations on Dominion worlds began to panic, and several outer colonies attempted to surrender directly to advancing human forces, rather than wait for the counter to catch up to them. Sekvaros, sitting on his throne in the heart of Velkar Prime, stared at the counter on his personal display, and felt something he had never felt before in his long life of conquest and dominion. He felt afraid, not of defeat, because defeat was something a warrior could understand and accept, but of something beyond defeat, something absolute and final. And he realized with a cold certainty that the humans had not made an empty threat in that forum chamber. They had made a promise, and they were going to keep it, and there was nothing in the galaxy that was going to stop them. In the space between Dominion worlds, Admiral Vasek stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the counter tick upward, and his face showed nothing at all, because he had made peace with what he was doing long before the first shot was fired. "Continue the advance," he said, and his fleet moved deeper into Dominion space, like a tide that only flowed in one direction. The galaxy watched and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say, and because every pause in the moment and beyond, species that had ever considered humanity a minor player on the galactic stage was now revising that assessment with a speed that bordered on panic. Humanity had told the galaxy exactly what it was going to do, and then it had done it. That, more than the weapons or the fleets or the impossible technology, was what terrified them the most. Not the power, but the certainty, the absolute unshakable willingness to follow through on a promise that the rest of the galaxy had assumed was too terrible to be real. It was real. The counter proved it with every passing second. 5 months after the massacre of Colony Eden 7, the sky above Velkar Prime turned dark with human ships. They came out of FTL in waves, fleet after fleet, emerging from the nothing between dimensions and taking position in a formation that encircled the planet, like a fist slowly closing. And when the last ship had arrived and the last engine had settled into orbit, there were so many of them that the people on the surface could look up during the day and see their shadows passing across the sun. Velkar Prime was a world of 11 billion souls, the beating heart of the Dominion, a planet that had never been threatened in its entire recorded history. And now it sat beneath an armada that could reduce it to ash in a matter of hours. The Dominion's remaining defense fleet, barely 400 ships that had survived the months of relentless human advance, formed a final line between the planet and Admiral Vasek's forces, and every captain aboard those ships knew, with absolute clarity, that they were going to die, not because they lacked courage, but because courage means nothing when the mathematics of destruction are this one-sided. On the bridge of his flagship, Vasek studied the defensive formation with the calm focus of a man who had long ago separated his emotions from his decisions. And then he opened a communication channel. "Velkari Defense Fleet," he said, "you have 1 hour to power down your weapons and withdraw to the surface, or you will be destroyed. This is not a negotiation." 312 of the 400 ships powered down within 20 minutes. The remaining 88 fought, and they were gone in less than 15 minutes, their wreckage falling through the atmosphere like burning rain that lit up the night sky over the Dominion capital. Inside the Imperial fortress at the center of that capital, High Dominarch Sekvaros sat on his throne and stared at a display screen that showed the human fleet in orbit and the counter that had haunted his people for months. Debt owed, 1,197,422,000. Debt paid, 48,002,300. Remaining, 1,149,419,700. The numbers were enormous and terrible, and Sekvaros understood what they meant. If the humans honored their declaration, what was about to happen to Velkar Prime would be the single greatest act of destruction in the recorded history of the galaxy. He had spent his entire life believing that strength was the only language the universe understood, that mercy was weakness, and compassion was a flaw that evolution would eventually correct. And now he sat in the shadow of a species that had proven itself stronger than anything his civilization had ever produced. And he discovered that his philosophy offered him no comfort at all when he was the one looking up at the guns. With trembling hands that had never trembled before, the High Dominarch of the Velkari Dominion activated an open communication channel and spoke words that his ancestors would have killed him for. "United Earth Confederacy," he said, and his voice cracked on the first syllable. "The Velkari Dominion offers its unconditional surrender, and we beg for mercy." He paused, and the pause was filled with the weight of 11 billion lives hanging on whatever came next. "We acknowledge our crime against your people. We acknowledge the massacre of Colony Eden 7, and we submit ourselves to whatever judgment you see fit to deliver. But we ask that you spare our world, spare our children, as we did not spare yours." The irony of that last phrase hung in the air like poison, because everyone who heard it knew exactly what the Velkari had done to the children of Eden 7. And asking for the mercy you denied others is perhaps the most desperate prayer any species can offer. The galaxy waited. On every forum station and trading post and colony world and homeworld across known space, billions of beings from hundreds of species watched their screens and held their breath, because this was the moment that would define not just humanity, but the future of galactic civilization itself. If the humans honored their counter, if they followed through on the declaration that had shaken the galaxy to its core, then Velkar Prime would burn, and 11 billion would die, and the galaxy would learn that the universe truly was nothing but a place of predators and prey. And if they did not, if they stopped, then something else would be proven, something that most species had stopped believing in a long time ago. On the bridge of his flagship, Admiral Vasek received the surrender transmission and listened to it without expression, and then he turned to his communications officer. "Connect me to Earth," he said. In Geneva, Secretary-General Anara Osei received the transmission from Vasek, and she listened to the Dominarch's surrender, closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, she did not look at the military displays or the tactical readouts, or the counter that had been ticking upward for months. She looked at a photograph on her desk, a picture of Eden 7 taken before the attack, showing green fields and a blue sky and a group of children playing in a schoolyard, children who were now names on a list that would never stop hurting. She picked up the microphone and addressed the galaxy. "This is Secretary-General Anara Osei of the United Earth Confederacy, speaking to the Velkari Dominion and to every species listening across known space. 5 months ago, we made a declaration in the halls of the Galactic Forum, and we meant every word of it. And the campaign we have conducted since then has proven beyond any doubt that we had both the capability and the will to fulfill that declaration to its final number. We came to Velkar Prime with the power to end your civilization today. And I want every being in this galaxy to understand with absolute clarity that the decision not to do so is exactly that. A decision, a choice, made not from weakness, but from strength. Because the true measure of a species is not what it can destroy, but what it chooses to spare. But, she continued, and her voice hardened in a way that made every listener lean closer, let the record show, we were ready, we were willing, and we would have done it. And if any nation in this galaxy ever again mistakes our mercy for weakness, we will not choose twice. She then read the terms that Earth was offering in place of annihilation. The Velkari Dominion would be dissolved as a political entity, completely and permanently. High Dominarch Sekvaros and every member of the military command chain that had ordered or participated in the massacre of Eden 7 would be surrendered to a human-established war crimes tribunal to face justice for their actions. Every species that the Dominion had conquered and held as subjects would be granted immediate and unconditional independence, with human military protection during the transition. The Velkari species would not be exterminated, but it would be completely and permanently disarmed, stripped of all FTL-capable technology for 200 standard years, and placed under direct human oversight for the duration of that period. A permanent human military garrison would be established throughout former Dominion space to ensure compliance and to protect the newly liberated species. The terms were not gentle, and they were not designed to be, but they were alive, which was more than the Velkari had offered the people of Eden 7. Sekvaros accepted every condition without argument, because the alternative was visible in orbit above his world, and because he had learned in the span of 5 months what his species had failed to learn in 2,000 years. Dominion, that there is always something stronger, and the smart species are the ones that figure that out before it is too late. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy reorganized itself around a new reality. The Galactic Forum held a special session to ratify new protections for developing species. Protections that should have existed before Eden 7, but never did, because the elder species had not cared enough to create them. And humanity was granted a permanent seat on the Security Council, not because they were invited and not because they asked, but because no one in the galaxy had the courage to suggest otherwise. Trade agreements were rewritten, defense treaties were renegotiated, and a dozen species that had spent centuries bullying their smaller neighbors suddenly discovered a deep and sincere commitment to peaceful coexistence. Counselor Ylith of the Rythani sat in her quarters on the Forum station and recorded the final entry in her analysis of humanity, a document that would be placed in the deepest archives of Rythani civilization and marked for preservation across geological time. We have studied 10,000 species across 1,000,000 years, she wrote, and we have seen conquerors and destroyers and builders and dreamers, but we have never encountered a species that could hold the power of annihilation in one hand and restraint in the other, and choose restraint while making absolutely certain that the galaxy knew the annihilation was never a bluff. Humans are not to be pitied, she continued, and they are not to be tested. They are to be respected, and above all, they are to be remembered. She saved the document and closed her terminal and looked out her window at the stars, and she thought about what kind of galaxy this would be now that humanity had taken its place among the elder species. And she decided that for all the fear, and all the destruction, and all the terrible mathematics of the counter, she was glad, because the galaxy had needed something to shake it out of its ancient indifference, and humanity had done that more thoroughly than anything in 1,000,000 years of recorded history. On Earth, the celebrations were quiet, because there was nothing to celebrate in the traditional sense. The war was won, but the victory had been born from the ashes of over 1 million innocent people. And that was not something you cheered for. That was something you carried. Ambassador Dreyer returned to his apartment in Geneva, and sat alone in his kitchen, and drank a cup of coffee, and stared at the wall. And for the first time in 5 months, he allowed himself to think about the schoolteacher, Mara Okafor, and the 42 children she had tried to protect. And he wept. Secretary General Osei signed the formal dissolution of the Velkari Dominion, and then walked alone to a memorial that had been built in a park near the government complex. A wall of stone bearing the names of every person who had died on Eden 7, and she stood there for an hour, reading names she would never forget. And far away, on a world that had once been green and alive and full of laughter, Colony Eden 7 sat silent under a gray sky, its fields still scarred, its cities still ash, and at its center stood a monument that had been placed there by human hands, a tall column of white stone bearing 1,197,422 names, every single one carved so deep that no amount of time or weather would ever wear them away. At the base of the monument, 3 words were inscribed in every known language in the galaxy, a message not just for humanity, but for every species that would ever look upon that world and wonder what had happened there and why. 3 words that were both a memorial and a warning, a grief and a promise, a ending and a beginning. Never again, remember.